Hello. Today I'm going to talk about diabetes and what happens if someone has type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, or if someone doesn't have any diabetes at all. So, diabetes is a group of diseases since it contains type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and gestational diabetes, which we're not going to talk about today. And it's this group of diseases that is characterized by an unusually high amount of glucose in the blood. So the person's blood glucose level is going to be really, really high, higher than the average person's. And so what happens in a person who doesn't have any diabetes is, and actually the first step happens in all kinds of people, so even if they do have diabetes, but what happens is people eat food, and in the food contains carbohydrates. So when we swallow the food from our mouths, it goes through our digestive system, and in the digestive system, we have the small intestine. So when the food reaches the small intestine, the carbohydrates in the food get broken down into glucose. And so that's where we get our glucose from the food that we eat. And now the glucose is going to be, it's going to enter the bloodstream. And then in the bloodstream, there are many cells, and the glucose needs to go into the cells so the cells can use the glucose to provide energy for humans. So that way we don't feel tired all the time. And a diabetic person, their cells don't take in any of the glucose which comes from our food, and the glucose will just keep on building up, which is why they have an unusually high amount of glucose in their bloodstream. And that's why many diabetic people, they always feel very tired. They maybe feel weak, they feel nauseous, and they're always very thirsty because of that. So for a normal person, that person will produce insulin, which is produced by the pancreas. So the pancreas produces insulin, and the way that the pancreas knows how to produce insulin is when a person's blood glucose level is too high. And so that would trigger the pancreas to start producing the insulin, which is needed. So once the insulin is produced, it also goes into the bloodstream, and then it's going to go to a cell. Now the insulin will meet cell receptors, which are located on the cell membrane. And once they meet, that will trigger a protein called GLUT4, which is a protein channel that then goes up to the cell membrane, and it creates a little channel for the glucose to move into the cell, because without GLUT4, glucose is stuck outside the cell. It can't get into the cell. It can't give us energy by coming into the cell. Now, in a type 1 diabetic person, the person will not create any insulin. So their pancreas doesn't create any insulin, and because the person doesn't create any insulin, the insulin can't meet the insulin receptors on the cell, and so that will never trigger the GLUT4 to go to the cell membrane, which to allow the glucose in. So because of that, no glucose goes into the cell, and that person has a very high blood glucose level in their bloodstream. A person who has type 2 diabetes is different from a person who has type 1 diabetes because while a type 1 diabetic doesn't create any insulin, their pancreas will create zero insulin. A person who has type 2 diabetes will create insulin. However, they may create insufficient amounts of insulin. So if they do create insufficient amounts of insulin, then the insulin will not be able to activate the GLUT4 protein from allowing the glucose to enter the cell. Or a person with type 2 diabetes, they could have their insulin receptors could be resistant to insulin, and it won't bind properly with the insulin. And because of that, the GLUT4 will not be activated. So diabetes, you can think of it as a lock and key model. So the insulin is the key, and the insulin receptors are the lock. So you need the key to open up the lock. However, if the locks are resistant to the insulin, or if there's no insulin at all, like in type 1 diabetes, then the lock's not going to open, and that's not going to allow the GLUT4 to allow the glucose to enter the cell, to come in through the door of the cell. And because the glucose just stays outside the cell, since the GLUT4 doesn't let it come in, that's how a person is diabetic. That's So the person will have a very high blood glucose concentration in their blood, and they will be diabetic. We will be representing the process of diabetes with our model that we made. So the top layer is going to show how type 1 diabetes works. The second layer is going to show how type 2 diabetes works. And the bottom layer is going to show how someone who doesn't have any diabetes and how they're able to obtain glucose from the food and move into the cell. So let's start with type 1 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes, we're going to use these pink and red beads to show, to represent the glucose that enters the bloodstream right here. And then these green and blue beads are going to represent the insulin that the pancreas, which is these little yellow ball things, are made. Are made from. So what we're going to do first is we're going to put the glucose into the bloodstream. So it's going to enter, so food's going to enter through the mouth, and then glucose from the food will enter the bloodstream after the carbohydrates found in the food is broken down in the small intestine. So we're going to put it in the bloodstream. And after looking at that process, we see that in type 1 diabetes, the glucose is stuck outside the cell. So this is the cell and there's no glucose in it. The glucose is outside the cell. It's stuck in the bloodstream. It's all right there in the back. In type 2 diabetes, no glucose is in the cell either, if you look at it. Instead, the cell is also stuck in the bloodstream. While a normal person, if you look at the cell, there's a lot of glucose in the cell. That's because a normal person will be able to produce insulin that allows for the glucose to enter the cell. And we're going to show that process next. So we're going to put the insulin in. Now, if you look at a person with type 1 diabetes, no insulin was made by the pancreas. There's no insulin there that will be able to activate, that will be able to bind to the insulin receptors. If you look at someone with type 2 diabetes, the pancreas did create insulin. However, the insulin doesn't bind with the insulin receptors because the insulin's blue while the insulin receptors are pink. And if you look at a normal person, the insulin is blue while the insulin receptor is also blue, so they bind properly. And that's why if you look inside the cell of someone without diabetes, you see these yellow things. That's the GLUT4 molecules that are in the cell membrane that allow for the glucose to enter the cell. So this is how our diabetes model works, and we hope you learned a lot about diabetes. Thank you.